I first spotted Dennis Carson in the back row of Stanford's Hewlett Teaching Center during the 2019 International Symposium on Quantum Physics. He sat alone, 3 empty seats on either side, scribbling notes while Professor Tanaka presented his work on superposition states. Something about his intensity caught my attention. The way he'd occasionally stop writing to stare blankly at the presentation slides, his expression shifting from concentration to something closer to dread. The symposium program listed him as Dr. Dennis Carson, Johns Hopkins, retired, but offered no presentation title or abstract. I remembered his name from several groundbreaking papers on neural network patterning in the early 90s, but nothing since. His disappearance from academia had generated rumors, burnout, mental breakdown, even government recruitment. During the afternoon coffee break, I watched him avoid conversation with practiced efficiency. He filled a styrofoam cup, nodded politely at approaching colleagues, then slipped away before they could engage. His badge hung askew on a rumpled Oxford shirt that looked slept in. The contrast between his disheveled appearance and the meticulous notes I'd glimpsed on his pad intrigued me. After the final panel, I found him in the hotel bar, nursing what looked like scotch, his conference materials spread across the table. I approached with my own drink, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Mind if I join you? Dr. Mark Hadley." He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied my face. "Carson. Dennis Carson. I know. I've read your work on neural cascades and consciousness emergence. Brilliant stuff." I sat without waiting for explicit permission. "I've been trying to incorporate some of your theoretical frameworks into my research on quantum coherence in microtubules." His posture stiffened visibly. "You're working on consciousness research?" "Not directly. I'm a quantum physicist, but there's fascinating overlap with neurology these days." I took a sip of my drink. The potential quantum nature of consciousness has become something of a side interest. Dennis rotated his glass slowly, eyes fixed on the amber liquid. "There's a reason I left that field, Dr. Hadley." "Mark, please." I leaned forward. "And what reason was that? Your papers were groundbreaking, then nothing after '94. His gaze flicked up, suddenly sharp. "Career change. Nothing dramatic." "Into what, if you don't mind me asking?" "Industrial applications." He waved his hand dismissively. "Private sector pays better than academia." It was a practiced answer, delivered too smoothly. I decided to change tactics. "I've just submitted a grant proposal, actually, looking at quantum fluctuations in brain activity during near-death experiences." The change was immediate. Dennis's hand froze mid-air, drink halfway to his lips. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, then alarm. "Near-death research?" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You think that's clever? Pushing into that territory?" "It's hardly unexplored territory," I said, confused by his reaction. "There's decades of research, all wrong." He set his glass down with deliberate care. "All of it. Wrong methods. Wrong conclusions." He leaned closer. "Wrong questions." "What do you mean?" Dennis glanced around the bar, then checked his watch. "I should go." "We've barely started talking. Trust me, you don't want to hear what I have to say." He gathered his papers with trembling hands. "At least not here." I watched, bewildered, as he tossed cash on the table and walked out. Something about his reaction seemed disproportionate, almost fearful. Professional disagreement didn't typically evoke that kind of response. I finished my drink slowly, mulling over our brief exchange. Whatever had driven Dennis Carson from his field clearly still haunted him. As a researcher, I couldn't help but be curious. I paid my tab and headed for the elevator. The parking lot was nearly empty when I crossed it toward my rental car. A figure emerged from between 2 vehicles. Dennis, his collar turned up against the evening chill. "Dr. Hadley?" He approached cautiously. "Mark, I apologize for my abrupt departure." No need to apologize. There is. He glanced toward the hotel, then back to me. Listen, would you have time to talk privately? Tomorrow evening, perhaps? I studied his face in the harsh parking lot lights. Shadows accentuated the hollows beneath his eyes, the deep lines around his mouth. Sure, I said. My room or yours? Yours would be better. 8 p.m.? Another nervous glance over his shoulder. Room number? 412. He nodded once, sharply. Tomorrow, then. Please don't mention this conversation to anyone. Before I could respond, he walked away, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. The next evening, I straightened my already tidy room for the third time, unsure what to expect. At 8:12, a soft knock came at the door. Dennis entered quickly, scanning the room before fully stepping inside. Do you mind if I check something? He asked, pulling a small device from his pocket. Be my guest. He moved methodically around the room, holding the device near light fixtures, behind the television, along the baseboards. I recognized it as a rudimentary RF detector, the kind sold to paranoid businessmen concerned about corporate espionage. Is that really necessary? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. You'd be surprised. He completed his circuit of the room and pocketed the device. Thank you for indulging me. Dennis looked worse than the previous day, his shirt wrinkled, tie loosened, hair uncombed. He sat on the edge of the desk chair, declined my offer of the minibar, and rubbed his hands together nervously. I worked for the government, he finally said. From 1987 to 1994, a classified program. I nodded, waiting. We were recruited under false pretenses, told we'd be advancing medical science. He stared at his hands. And we were, initially. But the project's true purpose became something else. What kind of project? I kept my voice neutral, trying not to sound skeptical. Dennis looked up, his eyes suddenly clear and focused. We discovered something about death, Dr. Hadley. Something no one should know. You mean what happens after death? Precisely that. He leaned forward. And it's not what anyone thinks, not what anyone hopes for. Despite my scientific skepticism, the absolute conviction in his voice made my skin crawl. This wasn't the rambling of a conspiracy theorist, at least not entirely. There was methodical certainty in his tone, the gravity of someone who believed every word. I know how this sounds, he continued. I was like you once, rational, evidence-based, skeptical of anything beyond material explanation. He pressed his fingertips to his temples. I wish I still was. Why tell me this? Your research, the direction you're heading. He shook his head. You're getting too close to areas that will draw attention. The wrong kind. I leaned back, crossing my arms. From whom? The government? Yes. And others. His gaze drifted to the window, then snapped back. I can't explain more tonight. It's not safe. Dennis, No. He stood abruptly. I shouldn't have come. Not yet. He moved to the door. If you're serious about understanding consciousness at death, contact me. But know that once you start down this path, there's no going back. He handed me a business card with only a phone number written in blue ink. This is a secure line. If you call, use a public phone. Not your cell, not your office. His hand gripped the doorknob. And Mark, watch for patterns, electronic malfunctions, dreams of darkness. If they start, contact me immediately. Before I could formulate a response, he was gone, leaving me holding his card and a growing sense of unease. Over the next months, I tried to dismiss our strange encounter. I returned to Stanford, immersed myself in my research, and filed Dennis Carson under interesting but unstable colleagues. But curiosity got the better of me. I found myself researching his early career, tracing his publications until they abruptly stopped in 1994. Employment records showed he'd left Johns Hopkins for a government position, then resurfaced 3 years later as a consultant for various pharmaceutical companies. In February, I received my first email. The sender used an encrypted address, but the content, an obscure journal article on quantum consciousness, coupled with the single line, "Consider the implications for transition states." D, confirmed the source. More messages followed. Scientific papers, obscure research from Eastern European institutions, scanned pages from religious texts dealing with afterlife concepts. Sometimes weeks passed between communications. Other times, 3 would arrive in a single day. Each message grew increasingly frantic in tone, with annotations that became less scientific and more paranoid. In June, I finally called the number from a payphone at a gas station outside campus. "I've been receiving your materials," I said when he answered. "And? What do you think?" His voice sounded thin, stretched. "I think you're trying to tell me something without actually telling me. Not over the phone." A pause. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Electronic devices behaving erratically? Dreams?" "No, nothing like that." "Good. That's good." He exhaled audibly. "It means you're not on their radar yet." "Whose radar, Dennis? You need to give me something concrete." "I will, soon. I'm compiling everything. Documentation, evidence." His voice dropped. "When it's ready, we'll meet. Somewhere safe." The call ended there, and his communications became even more sporadic. By October, they'd taken on a rambling quality that concerned me. References to them watching, coordinates of places with supposed thin barriers, and increasingly urgent warnings to abandon my research. In November, my phone rang at 3:17 a.m. They found me. Dennis's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't have much time. Do you still have that card with my number?" I fumbled for the light. "Yes, somewhere." On the back, "There's an address in Montana, cabin outside Missoula." His words tumbled out between shallow breaths. "Come as soon as you can. Tell no one where you're going. Use cash. Switch vehicles if possible." "Dennis, you're scaring me. Maybe you should go to the hospital." "No." The sharpness made me flinch. "No hospitals, no police. No one can help with this." A sound like laughter, but hollow. "I need to tell someone before it's too late. You're the only one who might understand." "Understand what?" "What happens when we die." There was a scratching sound, then, "Please, Mark, I don't have anyone else." I agreed to come, more out of concern for his mental state than belief in his claims. As I packed a bag the next morning, I told myself I was simply checking on a troubled colleague. But beneath that rationalization ran a current of something else. The unmistakable pull of forbidden knowledge, and the growing suspicion that Dennis Carson's terror might be founded on something real. The gravel road to Dennis's cabin deteriorated into little more than a dirt track as I navigated the final mile. My rental car, a nondescript sedan I'd swapped for my original at a smaller airport as Dennis had suggested, struggled against the steep incline. Montana in December was brutally cold, the landscape a stark monochrome of white snow and dark pines beneath a slate-gray sky. I hadn't seen another vehicle for 20 minutes when the cabin finally appeared. A weathered structure nestled against the tree line, smoke curling from its chimney. Nothing about its exterior seemed unusual, just a typical remote mountain retreat. Before I could exit my car, the cabin door swung open. Dennis stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light inside. Even from this distance, I could see how much he'd changed. The academic with rumpled clothes had transformed into something else entirely. Gaunt, unshaven, with the hyper-vigilant posture of prey. "Get inside quickly," he called, his eyes scanning the perimeter behind me. I grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat and trudged through ankle-deep snow to the porch. "Did anyone follow you?" Dennis asked, still looking past me rather than at me. "No, I did everything you said. Cash only, switched cars, no phone calls." He nodded sharply, ushering me inside before securing the door, with what I now saw were 3 separate deadbolts. A heavy metal bar slid into place across the entire frame. "Sorry about all this," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Necessary precautions." The cabin's interior stopped me cold. Every wall was transformed into a chaotic collage. Newspaper clippings, scientific diagrams, and printed emails layered atop one another. Religious symbols from traditions I recognized and many I didn't were interspersed throughout. Crosses, mandalas, stars of David, intricate geometric patterns, and ancient-looking sigils. Red string connected various points, creating a web of associations I couldn't begin to comprehend. Dennis caught my expression. "Looks crazy, I know." I wouldn't say, "You would, and you'd be right." A thin smile crossed his face. By conventional standards, anyway. Security cameras were mounted in each corner of the main room, their feeds displaying on a small bank of monitors on a desk. A metal box hummed in the corner, which I recognized as a signal jammer. "You've gone off the grid," I observed. "As much as possible." Dennis moved to an old wood stove where a kettle was brewing. "Coffee?" "Please." He poured 2 mugs, then pulled a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet and added a generous splash to each. "For the cold," he explained, handing me a mug. I accepted it, grateful for the warmth against my palms. The cabin was heated, but barely. A persistent chill clung to the air. Dennis gestured toward a worn sofa facing the wood stove. "Sit. You must be exhausted." I sank into the couch, the coffee's warmth spreading through me, whiskey burning pleasantly at the back of my throat. Dennis remained standing, too restless to sit. "I appreciate you coming," he said finally. Not many would have. "I wasn't sure what to make of your calls, your emails, but you clearly believe something significant is happening." "Not believe. No." Dennis rubbed his hands together nervously. "I've been debating how to tell you this, where to start. The beginning usually works." He nodded, taking a long drink from his mug. "The beginning. 1987 then, Johns Hopkins. I was doing what I thought was important work, neural revival after traumatic brain injury, making real progress." Dennis walked to a locked cabinet, produced a key from around his neck, and opened it. From inside, he removed a folder bound with elastic bands. They approached me at a conference. 2 men, government types, though they never specified which agency, said they were assembling a special research team for a classified project. He returned to place the folder on the coffee table between us. They were very convincing about the humanitarian applications. I opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents so heavily redacted they resembled abstract art, black rectangles consuming most of the text. But certain elements remained visible. Letterhead with government seals, signatures, dates. "Project Threshold," I read from one partially visible title. "Yes." Dennis's voice tightened. "That's what they called it. 30 researchers from different fields, neuroscience, medicine, physics, biology, even philosophy and religious studies, all housed in a facility about 40 miles from what tourists call Area 51. "Nevada?" Dennis nodded, pulling more items from the folder, a laminated security badge with his younger face, photographs of a desert facility partially built into a hillside, more documents. "Officially, we were researching methods to extend the survival window after clinical death. Heart attacks, drowning, trauma, cases where minutes matter. The public-facing purpose was to develop protocols for emergency services." I examined the badge, noting the sophisticated holographic elements that would be difficult to fake. "And the real purpose?" Dennis stared into his mug for a long moment before answering. "To investigate what consciousness experiences during death." I kept my expression neutral despite the chill that ran through me. How would you even approach that scientifically? Very carefully. Dennis's laugh was hollow. "We developed a protocol using a proprietary drug cocktail controlled hypothermia, and targeted electromagnetic stimulation of the brain. It allowed us to temporarily induce clinical death and then reliably reverse it. You were killing people? That's unethical, illegal. Dennis's voice sharpened. Of course it was. We justified it because our subjects were all terminal patients, volunteers who believed they were receiving experimental treatment for their conditions. The moral implications were staggering. They didn't know the real purpose? No. They signed waivers, but the language was deliberately obscure. Dennis paced the length of the room. We told ourselves we were advancing science, that their sacrifices would benefit humanity. I flipped through more documents, my scientific skepticism battling with the growing weight of evidence. Even if you could reliably induce and reverse death, how could you possibly document what consciousness experienced? That's where the breakthrough came. Dennis paused at the window, peering through the blinds before continuing. We discovered certain genetic markers, variations in the COMT and COMP genes, specifically, that allowed some individuals to retain memories from their time in clinical death. A scientific part of me perked up at this detail. These genes were associated with memory formation and neurotransmitter regulation. There was at least a theoretical foundation that made sense. What percentage of subjects had these markers? I asked. About 17%. Dennis returned to his cabinet, locking the folder away. We originally screened for them, but later we specifically recruited subjects with these markers. Outside, the wind picked up, branches scratching against the cabin walls. Dennis froze at the sound, his head tilting toward the ceiling. Dennis? He held up a hand for silence, listening intently. After a long moment, his shoulders relaxed slightly. Just the wind, he muttered, though whether to me or himself wasn't clear. I noticed how the daylight had faded, the room now primarily lit by lamps that cast long shadows across the walls covered in papers and symbols. Dennis checked each window methodically, adjusting blinds to eliminate any gaps. They're more active at night, he said quietly. Who is? Not who. He turned to face me, his expression deadly serious. What? The entities, the ones listening from the other side. I set down my mug, trying to maintain a neutral expression. Dennis, maybe we should continue this conversation after you've rested. He checked his watch, seeming to come back to himself slightly. Yes, you're right. You've traveled all day, and this isn't information that should be rushed. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. There's a bedroom through that door. Bathroom attached. I've put fresh sheets on the bed. What about you? I don't sleep much anymore. He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When I do, I use the couch. Better vantage point to watch the monitors. I stood, gathering my duffel. We'll continue in the morning, then? Dennis nodded, his gaze drifting to a darkened corner of the room. In the morning, I'll tell you what we found in the void. What's waiting for all of us. He suddenly seemed to remember something, gesturing to a device on the bedside table. There's a white noise machine in your room. Use it. It helps block them out. Block what out? The whispers. Dennis turned away, ending the conversation. Sleep well, Mark, while you still can. I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind me. The room was sparse but clean, a double bed with plain navy sheets, a wooden dresser, and heavy curtains drawn across the single window. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything Dennis had shared. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations, paranoid delusions, PTSD from classified research, perhaps substance abuse. But another part remembered the authenticity of those security badges, the official documents, the clinical way he had described the project's methodology. Beyond the door, I could hear Dennis moving around, checking locks, muttering to himself. I switched on the white noise machine, its gentle static filling the room, muffling the sounds of Dennis's restless movements and whatever whispers he was so afraid of hearing in the night. I lay back on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, Dennis would tell me the rest, what they had discovered about death, about consciousness, about whatever had transformed a brilliant neurologist into a paranoid recluse hiding in the Montana wilderness. Despite my exhaustion, sleep was long in coming. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of papers being shuffled. Sunlight filtered weakly through a gap in the bedroom's heavy curtains, casting a thin line across the worn floorboards. I'd slept poorly, my dreams filled with fragmentary images of hospital corridors and faceless researchers. When I emerged from the bedroom, Dennis was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by file folders arranged in precise stacks. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were bloodshot, but his hands were steady as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. "You look like hell," I said, accepting the coffee he pushed toward me. "No whiskey this morning. We need clear heads." Dennis gestured to the chair across from him. "I organized everything, all the evidence I managed to smuggle out before they shut us down." I sat down, noting the methodical labels on each folder. Dennis had clearly been preparing for this moment for years. "How much trouble would you be in if they knew you had these?" I asked. Dennis let out a humorless laugh. "Prison would be the least of my concerns." He pushed a thick manila folder toward me. "This is where it began. 37 test subjects, all terminal patients. Pancreatic cancer, late-stage ALS, glioblastoma, people with months to live at most." I opened the folder to find photographs of ordinary-looking men and women, clinical profiles attached with paperclips. Ages ranged from 26 to 82. Each file contained consent forms with government letterhead. "They thought they were volunteering for experimental treatments?" I asked. "That's what we told them." Dennis's voice cracked slightly. "A chance to contribute to science while potentially extending their lives. The truth was, we were systematically killing them." He reached for another folder. "The protocols evolved. Initially, we induced clinical death for only 15 to 20 seconds before revival. By the end, we were pushing 7 minutes. The folder contained detailed procedures, drug cocktails, controlled hypothermia techniques, electromagnetic suppression of neural activity, and precise revival protocols. The level of scientific sophistication was impressive and disturbing. Complete flatlining," Dennis continued. "No brain activity whatsoever. Then revival using targeted electrical stimulation and chemical compounds that forced cellular regeneration. And it worked?" I thumbed through pages of EEG readouts showing flatlines followed by gradual resumption of brain activity. "In about 60% of cases. The rest died permanently." Dennis rubbed his face. "We had specific markers we were looking for, certain genetic configurations that our preliminary research suggested would allow for memory retention during clinical death." "Memory of what exactly?" Dennis went still, his eyes focusing somewhere past my shoulder. "That was the question that destroyed us all." He pulled another folder from the stack, this one marked with a red stripe. "These are debriefing transcripts from subjects who could recall their experiences. The transcripts were heavily redacted, black marker obscuring entire paragraphs, but enough remained legible. I read through several pages, feeling a growing coldness that had nothing to do with the Montana winter outside." "They all described the same thing?" I asked, looking up at Dennis. He nodded slowly. "With remarkable consistency, a conscious void, absolute isolation, no light, no sound, no sensation, just awareness trapped in timeless darkness." His voice had taken on a distant quality. "Do you know what Einstein said about time relativity? Well, our subjects experienced the ultimate perversion of that concept. Seconds of clinical death translated to perceived eternities of solitary consciousness." I continued reading, my coffee cooling forgotten beside me. The clinical language of the reports couldn't mask the horror they contained. Subject number 17, Dennis said, tapping one particular file. Former Methodist minister. He attempted suicide immediately after revival, slammed his head against the restraint bar until he fractured his skull. The interview transcript before that happened is illuminating. I turned to the indicated page. The subject's responses were recorded verbatim. Can you describe what you experienced during the procedure? It wasn't dark. That implies the absence of light. This was the absence of everything except my own thoughts. No body, no sensations, no passage of time. Just me, alone with increasingly torturous thoughts. It felt like years, decades, just trapped. Did you see or hear anything? The subject becomes agitated. There's nothing to see or hear. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's consciousness without stimuli, left with only itself, feeding on itself like a snake eating its own tail. Don't you understand? There's nothing else there. Jesus, I muttered, feeling a chill run down my spine. Subject number 23 never spoke again after revival. Complete catatonia. Dennis pulled out another file. Subject number 29 begged us to kill her permanently, rather than let her experience the void again. She said even oblivion would be better than that conscious emptiness, that awareness without end. Dennis's hands trembled as he stacked the folders in front of me. We started the project with such excitement, the potential to scientifically document the afterlife, to provide proof of consciousness beyond physical death. We thought we'd find heaven, or at least some form of cosmic continuation. His laugh was bitter, broken. Instead, we found something worse than nothingness. These are just subjective experiences, I said, trying to maintain some scientific detachment. Neural misfirings during revival, perhaps. Hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation. That's what we told ourselves at first, Dennis interrupted. Comfortable explanations, but the consistency across subjects with vastly different backgrounds, beliefs, and expectations became impossible to ignore. The void was waiting for all of them, for all of us. He stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin space. The government response was to increase funding. They wanted more data, more subjects. They expanded the project parameters to determine if the experience varied based on religious belief, cultural background, even method of death. And did it? Dennis stopped pacing, looking at me with haunted eyes. No, the void waits for everyone, regardless of what they believed in life. That's what broke us, Mark, the universal consistency of it. He moved to a cardboard box in the corner, pulling out more files. The psychological effects on the research team were severe. Dr. Landon started having panic attacks during the night, insisting he could feel the void waiting for him when he closed his eyes. Dr. Wilson became obsessed with ancient religious texts, looking for any historical evidence that contradicted our findings. Dennis's breathing had become rapid, shallow. 2 researchers committed suicide within months of each other. Dr. Caroline Mitchell drove her car off a cliff with a note that simply said, "I can't wait for it anymore." Dr. James Thorne shot himself in his office after burning all his research notes. The clinical detachment Dennis had maintained earlier was crumbling. Dr. Elise Kendrick was institutionalized after she sabotaged equipment during Test Series 4. She said she couldn't bear sending more people into that emptiness, even temporarily. Dennis collapsed back into his chair, his face ashen. We did this, Mark. We pierced the veil thinking we were expanding human knowledge, and instead, we destroyed the one comfort humans have always had, the hope that death brings peace. I stared at the mountains of evidence before me, my scientist's mind racing to find alternative explanations while a deeper, more primitive part of me recognized the authentic horror in the accounts. You understand now why I left the program, why I've been hiding? Dennis leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. This knowledge, it changes everything. How we live, how we face death. The government wanted it classified not just for the usual reasons, but because they understood what it would do to society. if people knew. Outside, the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground. I thought about the implications of what Dennis was sharing, the existential weight of it, the philosophical devastation. If consciousness truly persisted in that isolated void after death, what did that mean for everything we thought we knew about human existence? "There's more," Dennis said quietly, reaching for another folder. Subject number 36 changed everything. He paused, hand hovering over the file. "But we should eat something first. This is where it gets worse." I watched him move to the kitchen area, his shoulders hunched as if carrying physical weight. The folders on the table seemed to pulse with dark significance as I tried to prepare myself for what could possibly be worse than what I'd already learned. Dennis prepared a simple meal of canned soup and crackers. We ate in silence, the weight of what I'd already learned pressing down on both of us. Outside, heavy clouds had moved in, dimming the afternoon light and casting the cabin into shadow. Dennis switched on more lamps, his eyes constantly darting to the windows and the security monitors. I finished my soup and pushed the bowl away. "You said it gets worse. How is that possible?" Dennis gathered our dishes mechanically. "We should sleep. You look exhausted and tomorrow will be difficult." "I didn't come all this way to wait, Dennis." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "No, I suppose you didn't." That night, Dennis gave me a sleeping pill, insisting I would need rest for what came next. I reluctantly took it, falling into a dreamless sleep while he continued his endless pacing, checking and rechecking the locks and security feeds. The next morning brought heavy snow. I woke to find Dennis sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a single manila folder. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept again. "Coffee's hot," he said without looking up. I poured myself a cup and joined him at the table. "How long have you been sitting here?" "A few hours or minutes. Time gets slippery sometimes." He traced his finger along the folder's edge. "This is what I brought you here to see." The folder was marked simply 36 in faded red ink. "October 1994, Dennis began, his voice hoarse. By then, we'd refined our protocols. 23 subjects had confirmed the void experience. The government wanted to push boundaries, extend death periods, gather more data. He opened the folder, revealing a photograph of an elderly man with piercing eyes and a thin face. Despite his obvious illness, his expression conveyed remarkable intelligence and determination. Harold Weber, 78 years old, terminal pancreatic cancer with about 6 weeks left. Former theoretical physicist who'd worked on early quantum field theories in the 1960s. Dennis's finger trembled slightly as he touched the photo. He was different from our other subjects. How so? Most volunteers were desperate, hoping for miracle cures. Weber knew better. He came specifically because of his scientific background. Said he wanted to approach death with empirical curiosity. He understood exactly what we were doing. Dennis pulled out medical charts and procedure documents. Weber requested something unprecedented, an extended death period. Previous subjects had been clinically dead for 2 to 7 minutes. Weber asked for 10. "And you allowed that?" The data potential was too tempting to refuse. Dennis's voice cracked. Dr. Zhao authorized 9 minutes. We prepared for probable brain damage upon revival. He extracted a transcript labeled Debriefing Session 1, Subject Number 36. The procedure went perfectly. 9 minutes of complete clinical death. No brain activity whatsoever. And then we brought him back. Dennis paused, rubbing his face with shaking hands. He was calm, unnaturally calm. Everyone else came back screaming, thrashing, terrified. Weber just opened his eyes and asked for water. I reached for the transcript, but Dennis held it back. "You need to understand what happened first." His eyes locked with mine. Weber changed everything. He wasn't alone in the void. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. According to every previous subject, the void was empty, just isolated consciousness. But Weber, Dennis swallowed hard. Weber encountered something else there, something ancient, something that had become aware of him, of us. He finally relinquished the transcript. I began reading, my heart rate accelerating with each line. Dr. Weber, can you describe what you experienced? It wasn't empty, not completely. Something else exists there, has always existed there. Something else? Another person? Subject laughs. No, not a person, not alive as we understand life. Something vast, ancient. It existed before our universe and will remain after its heat death. Can you elaborate on what this something was? I lack the vocabulary. It's like describing color to someone born blind. The closest approximation would be a consciousness composed of anti-existence, aware, intelligent, and filled with hatred for all living things. I looked up at Dennis, who was staring at the wall, his eyes unfocused. "Keep reading," he whispered. "Did this entity communicate with you?" "Yes. Not with words, with pure concept, transmitted directly. It became aware of me, and through me, it became aware of what we're doing here, our probing into death." "What did it communicate?" Subject becomes visibly distressed. It's imprisoned there, in that place between existence. It cannot enter our reality until the universe's natural collapse. Then it will be freed to consume everything. This sounds like a hallucination induced by oxygen deprivation, Dr. Weber. Subject smiles. That's what I told myself initially, a comforting explanation. But I know the difference between hallucination and reality. I've experienced both during my cancer treatments. This was real, and it's watching us now. I turned the page, my hands no longer steady. "You believe this entity is observing us?" "I know it is. It found a doorway through me, a connection, and it made a promise." "What promise?" Subject leans forward, voice dropping. "It will hunt every soul, every consciousness, drag them back, not to the void, to something worse. It showed me, suffering beyond comprehension, eternal, for everyone." Subject begins writing equations on a notepad. "Dr. Weber, I think we should end this session. You need rest." Subject still writing frantically. "No time. It's coming. It found the way through me. Have to explain. The mathematics will show you." The transcript ended abruptly. I looked up to find Dennis staring at me, tears streaming down his face. "What happened next?" I asked. "Weber committed suicide that night, broke a light bulb and used the glass to slash his carotid artery." Dennis's voice was flat, emotionless. "But before that, he covered 3 whiteboards with equations and symbols. Things none of us fully understood." Dennis reached for another folder, this one containing photographs. "These are copies. The originals were confiscated and destroyed when they shut down the project." The photos showed whiteboards filled with dense mathematical expressions. Even with my physics background, I recognized only portions, formulas related to cosmic entropy, modified quantum field equations, and strange symbolic representations I'd never encountered. The program directors terminated Project Threshold immediately, destroyed research materials, dispersed personnel across different classified programs, and imposed severe non-disclosure agreements. Dennis's hands trembled as he organized the photos. 3 armed men in unmarked uniforms came for Weber's body before local authorities could be notified. His family was told he died peacefully from his cancer. I studied the equations, trying to make sense of Weber's work. Some elements resembled theoretical approaches to dimensional boundaries, but with disturbing modifications. "Did anyone decipher these?" I asked. Dr. Zhao tried. She had a background in theoretical physics before medicine. She said Weber had developed a mathematical representation of consciousness as a quantum field that persisted beyond physical death. These equations suggested the entity exists in a state of negative existence, Not merely non-existence, but something actively opposed to existence itself. Dennis stood suddenly, moving to the window to peer through a crack in the curtains. They're all gone now. Everyone who worked directly with Weber. Dr. Zhao disappeared in 2003. Dr. Erickson died in a single car accident in 1998. Dr. Patel allegedly overdosed in 2001. You think they were silenced? I asked. Dennis turned, his face haggard in the dim light. Not by the government, by themselves. He returned to the table, pulling out his own notebook filled with meticulously documented dates and names. I've tracked everyone from the project. 27 researchers, 17 are dead, 14 by suicide, 3 by accidents that might as well have been suicide. The rest, like me, are simply waiting. Outside, the snow fell heavier, isolating us further from the world. Dennis continued talking, his words flowing faster as if racing against something only he could sense. After Weber, I couldn't sleep. None of us could. We all felt it, being watched from somewhere beyond perception. Electronics malfunctioned in patterns too consistent for coincidence. Shadows moved independently of light sources, and the dreams... He shuddered visibly. Dreams of being observed by something vast and ancient and hungry. I wanted to discount everything as the ravings of a man broken by psychological trauma, but the evidence before me, the consistency of the accounts, the government documentation, Weber's equations, all spoke to something horrifyingly real. Is that why you contacted me? I asked. To verify Weber's equations? Dennis shook his head. I contacted you because you were headed down the same path with your research proposal, the same door we opened. His eyes met mine, filled with a desperate intensity. And because someone needs to survive who understands what we found, what's coming for all of us. He gathered the folders with trembling hands, stacking them neatly. Now you know. The truth about death, about what waits beyond. Not peace, not heaven, not even oblivion. Just a hungry void in the thing that lives there, watching, always watching. Dennis's voice dropped to a whisper. And the worst part? We invited it in. I sat back, trying to process everything. Outside, the daylight was fading again, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Dennis moved methodically around the space, checking locks, adjusting surveillance monitors, his routines clearly worn into habit by years of fear. We should eat something, I said, desperate for any normalcy. I can heat more soup. Dennis nodded absently, his attention focused on one of the security monitors. Mark. His voice had changed, becoming tight with sudden fear. Did you see that? I moved to join him at the monitors, seeing nothing but swirling snow and darkening forest. See what? There. He pointed to the left screen, his finger shaking. Movement by the tree line. I stared at the monitor but saw only branches swaying in the wind. It's just the storm, Dennis. He wasn't listening. His eyes darted from screen to screen, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. It's found me. After all these years, it's finally found me. I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. Dennis, you need to rest. When was the last time you slept properly? He jerked away from my touch. Sleep? While it watches? While it waits? His laugh was brittle, breaking at the edges. No sleep. Not anymore. As I watched his fragile composure crumbling, I realized I was witnessing the end result of 26 years of constant fear. A brilliant mind broken by knowledge it was never meant to hold. Why don't you lie down for just an hour? I suggested gently. I'll watch the monitors. Dennis shook his head fiercely. You don't understand yet, but you will. He moved to the kitchen area, hands trembling as he poured more coffee. It always comes at night, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. I returned to the table, leafing through Weber's equations again. searching for some rational explanation that might help Dennis. The mathematics were elegant, internally consistent, but based on premises that defied conventional understanding. Outside, darkness fell completely. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the shadows in the corners deeper. Dennis continued his vigilant pacing, checking and rechecking doors and windows, muttering equations under his breath like prayers. As I watched him, I felt the first genuine sliver of fear penetrate my scientific skepticism. Not fear of some cosmic entity, but fear of what absolute conviction in such an entity had done to Dennis Carson. And beneath that, a deeper fear, that perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't wrong. I spent the night in a waking nightmare. Dennis refused to sleep, his eyes fixed on the security monitors while he muttered equations like protective incantations. His shotgun remained within arm's reach as he moved between windows, peering through narrow gaps in the curtains at nothing I could see. "You need to sleep," I told him around 3 a.m, my own eyes burning with exhaustion. "Can't," he replied, not looking at me. "It's strongest when consciousness wavers at the threshold of sleep. That's when it reaches through." I dozed fitfully on the couch, jerking awake whenever Dennis made sudden movements or exclaimed at shadows. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the cabin surrounded by a pristine white blanket that reflected the pale sunlight. The apparent serenity of the landscape stood in stark contrast to the chaos inside. Dennis looked worse than ever, his eyes bloodshot and sunken, yet he moved with unsettling purpose, pulling out more folders from containers hidden throughout the cabin. After they terminated Project Threshold, the government implemented what they called Protocol Infinite Silence, Dennis said while organizing documents on the kitchen table. His voice had taken on a clinical detachment that was somehow more disturbing than his earlier panic. The facility was completely demolished, not just abandoned. They collapsed the cave system with controlled detonations. He handed me photographs showing explosives being placed around concrete structures built into natural rock formations. These were taken by Dr. Wilson. He smuggled a camera during the evacuation. Cost him his life, ultimately. "The government killed him?" I asked. Dennis laughed, the sound brittle. "No. The government doesn't need to kill people who know about the void. We do it ourselves, eventually." He pushed more documents toward me. Personnel reassignment orders, security clearance paperwork, and non-disclosure agreements with severe penalty clauses. They scattered us. Different classified projects in different states. Made sure we couldn't compare notes or collaborate. I was sent to Boeing, ostensibly as a neurological specialist for their aerospace medicine division. Dennis tapped a Boeing employee badge with his photo. In reality, I was being monitored. We all were. By whom? I asked. Officially, a joint DIA-NSA task force. Unofficially. His eyes darted to the corners of the room. Something else was watching too. Dennis pulled out a battered leather journal, opening it to reveal meticulous handwritten entries spanning years. 3 months after project termination, Dr. Landon died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. 6 months later, Dr. Wilson drove his car into a concrete barrier at 90 miles per hour. 14 months after that, Dr. Patel ingested a lethal cocktail of chemicals from her lab. I scanned the entries, noting the clinical precision with which Dennis had documented each death. The government classified these as stress-related suicides following classified work. Security containment. But I knew better. Dennis leaned closer, his voice dropping. They weren't running from government silencing, Mark. They were trying to escape the entity's attention. Landon told me, the night before he died, he couldn't bear the feeling of being watched anymore. His words hung in the cabin's stale air. Outside, a branch snapped under the weight of snow, making Dennis flinch violently. "How do you know this entity is real?" I asked. "Scientific method demands evidence beyond anecdotal experience." Dennis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to an old cassette player on a shelf, pressing buttons with trembling fingers. The tape inside whirred to life. "I started recording myself sleeping in 1997, he explained. After the nightmares became too consistent to ignore. Static hissed from the speakers, followed by the sound of labored breathing. Then, a voice, recognizably Dennis, but speaking in what sounded like multiple languages layered together. Some phrases resembled ancient Greek, others something that might have been Sanskrit or Arabic. The voice rose and fell in unnatural patterns, the languages shifting mid-sentence. My arms prickled with involuntary goosebumps. "What language is that?" "I don't know," Dennis whispered. "I don't speak any of them." He stopped the tape, his hand shaking worse than before. "It happens 2 or 3 times a month. I've had linguistics professors analyze recordings. They identified fragments of at least 11 languages, including 3 dead ones. Some phrases they couldn't identify at all." I rubbed my face, searching for rational explanations. Cryptomnesia, maybe? Fragments of languages you've heard but don't consciously remember? I considered that, tested the hypothesis thoroughly. Dennis pulled out another journal, this one filled with documented experiments. I isolated myself from all media, monitored all my reading and conversations. The languages continued. Some predated human civilization, according to the experts. He slumped into a chair, suddenly looking very old. "There are things I haven't shown you yet, things I've experienced." He trailed off, staring at his hands. "Show me," I said. Dennis nodded slowly and moved to a locked metal box beneath his bed. The contents included a stack of hand-labeled VHS tapes and more journals. He selected one tape and slid it into an ancient VCR connected to a small television. 2003, he said as the screen flickered to life. "I installed motion-activated cameras throughout my house in Seattle." The grainy footage showed an empty living room. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, gradually, a shadow on the wall began to move, not shifting with changes in light, moving independently, elongating and contracting in distinctly unnatural patterns. As it moved, electronic interference distorted the image, creating static bands across the screen. "The shadow is moving against the light source," Dennis pointed out, his voice flat. "Physics doesn't allow that." I watched in silence as the shadow gradually formed what appeared to be a humanoid shape before the video dissolved into complete static. When the image returned, the room was empty. I've captured hundreds of similar incidents. Electronic devices malfunctioning in patterns. Shadows moving independently. Objects relocating when no one's present. Dennis ejected the tape. Each incident corresponds with periods of intense research into death or consciousness. When I focus my thoughts on the void, it notices. I stood up, needing to move, to process. "Dennis, there could be countless explanations. Electronic interference, power fluctuations." "I know what I've seen." Dennis slammed his fist on the table, sending papers scattering. The sudden outburst hung in the air between us. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I know what I've seen." He picked up the papers with methodical precision, hands still shaking. "After my 3rd year at Boeing, I requested transfer to their Montana facility. Needed isolation, distance from people. Started researching alternatives to the void." Dennis gestured toward bookshelves lining one wall, filled with texts spanning everything from quantum physics to ancient mysticism. "I've studied every discipline, every tradition. Quantum mechanics suggests consciousness might be fundamental to reality rather than emergent from it. Eastern mysticism proposes techniques for maintaining awareness during death transitions. Ancient Egyptian texts describe elaborate rituals to secure safe passage to an afterlife." He pulled out several notebooks filled with equations and diagrams. "I've developed theoretical models combining quantum consciousness theories with multiverse hypotheses, explored whether consciousness might transfer between dimensional planes rather than simply continuing in the void." I leafed through the notebooks, recognizing brilliant theoretical work buried beneath increasingly desperate annotations. Have you found anything?" I asked quietly. Dennis's face crumpled. Nothing. Nothing that withstands scientific scrutiny. Nothing that contradicts what Weber found. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. There's only the void, and the thing that watches from it. That night, I convinced Dennis to eat a proper meal. We heated canned stew on his small propane stove while snow began falling again outside. The normalcy of the activity seemed to temporarily calm him, though his eyes still darted to shadows and windows. "Have you considered psychiatric help?" I asked cautiously as we ate. "Even if everything you've experienced is real, the psychological toll alone warrants..." "Psychiatric help?" Dennis's laugh was hollow. "I tried that in '98, 3 different psychiatrists. The first diagnosed PTSD from classified research. The second suggested paranoid schizophrenia with visual hallucinations. The third prescribed antipsychotics that did nothing except dull my ability to notice when it was present." He pushed his bowl away, barely touched. "This isn't a mental health issue, Mark. It's metaphysical. Drugs can't address the reality of what waits beyond death." "Then what's the alternative?" I asked. "Living in constant fear? Hiding in remote cabins with security cameras and shotguns?" Dennis didn't answer. He just stared into his cooling stew, lost in thoughts I couldn't penetrate. Later that night, exhaustion finally overcame me. I collapsed onto the small bed in the spare room, falling immediately into deep sleep, despite the ongoing sounds of Dennis's vigilant pacing. I woke suddenly, heart pounding, to the sensation of being watched. The room was pitch black. No light came from beneath the door. I reached for my phone to check the time, but it was dead, despite being fully charged earlier. Silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the wind outside and a very soft, rhythmic sound I couldn't immediately identify. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, but it didn't work. The power was out. Moving carefully in the darkness, I found my way to the door and opened it. The main room was illuminated only by the blue glow of the security monitors, still functioning on backup power. Dennis sat perfectly still in a chair facing the corner of the room, his back to me. "Dennis?" I whispered. No response. The soft, rhythmic sound I'd heard was coming from him. Quiet, measured breathing. I moved closer, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. "Dennis, the power's out." Still nothing. As I reached his chair, I realized he was awake, eyes wide open, staring fixedly at the corner where 2 walls met the ceiling. "It's watching us right now," he whispered, not blinking, not turning. "Right there. Can you see it?" I followed his gaze to the empty corner, seeing nothing but shadows. "There's nothing there, Dennis." "It's watching us," he repeated, his voice eerily calm. "It's been watching since you arrived. You've drawn its attention too. Now it sees you, Mark. Now it knows you." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cabin's dropping temperature. Dennis continued staring, unmoving, as if transfixed. "We should get the power back on," I said, trying to sound practical, rational. "Power doesn't matter to it. Darkness or light, it sees the same." Dennis's voice remained monotone, detached. "It exists in the space between thoughts, in the moment between heartbeats, in the darkness behind closed eyelids." I reached for my phone again, using it as a flashlight despite its dead battery. The beam illuminated the corner, showing nothing but cobwebs and rough-hewn logs. "Nothing's there, Dennis," I insisted, my voice firmer than I felt. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes reflecting the blue monitor light in a way that made them appear almost black. "You still don't understand. You're still trying to see with eyes." A terrible smile crossed his face. "But soon you will. It's patient. It has eternity. And now it has your name." The security monitors suddenly went dark, plunging us into complete darkness. In the pitch black, Dennis began to laugh. a broken, hollow sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Now it begins for you too," he whispered from the darkness. "The watching, the waiting. Welcome to the rest of your life, Mark, and everything that comes after." I stood frozen in the perfect darkness, scientific certainty crumbling around me as I felt, for the first time since arriving, the unmistakable sensation of an attention that had nothing to do with Dennis. Something cold and ancient and hungry, focusing its awareness upon me from somewhere I couldn't see. And in that moment, despite all rational thought, I believed him. Morning arrived with harsh, bright sunlight reflecting off the snow-covered landscape outside. I hadn't slept after the power failure, spending those long hours sitting rigidly on the edge of the bed, straining my ears against the silence, and fighting the persistent sensation of being observed from angles that shouldn't exist. When I finally heard Dennis moving in the main room, I emerged cautiously. The cabin's power had mysteriously returned sometime before dawn. Dennis stood at the kitchen counter, methodically preparing coffee as though the previous night's events had never occurred. "Did you sleep well?" he asked without turning around. The casual normality of the question after what had happened made my skin crawl. "No, you know I didn't." Dennis nodded, his movements deliberate and precise as he poured 2 mugs of coffee. His hands, which had trembled continuously since my arrival, were now unnervingly steady. "You felt it last night," he said. Not a question, but a simple statement of fact. "It's attention." I accepted the coffee he offered, noticing how calm he appeared, a dramatic shift from his paranoid vigilance of the previous days. His eyes were clear despite the dark circles beneath them, his posture relaxed. "Something happened in the dark," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean—" "Please," Dennis interrupted, raising his hand. "We're past that point now." He gestured toward the kitchen table, which he had already arranged with several folders organized in perfect alignment. We sat across from each other, the morning light casting long shadows across the cabin floor. "I've made a decision," Dennis said, his voice steady. "And after what you experienced last night, you deserve to understand it completely." He opened the first folder, revealing detailed schematics of what appeared to be a shotgun. Remington 870 Tactical, 12 gauge. His finger traced the diagram with academic detachment. "I purchased it 4 years ago, specifically for this purpose." The clinical way he discussed suicide sent ice through my veins. "Dennis, whatever you're thinking, this isn't impulsive, Mark." He cut me off again, his tone almost gentle. "This is the result of 26 years of research, the only rational response to what I know." Dennis opened another folder containing neurological diagrams of the human brain alongside ballistic impact studies. "The problem isn't death itself," he continued. "It's the continuity of consciousness after physical death. If consciousness persists, intact and coherent, the entity can track it, capture it." He tapped the diagrams. "But what if consciousness could be completely destroyed along with its physical substrate?" I stared at the grotesque ballistics charts. "You're talking about obliterating your brain. Complete neurological destruction." Dennis nodded, his academic detachment chilling. "The shotgun ensures both extensive physical damage and the disruption of electrical patterns that might preserve consciousness." He slid another folder toward me. "I've cross-referenced near-death experiences, quantum consciousness theories, and obscure theological texts from 24 different traditions." The folder contained hundreds of photocopied pages, scientific journal articles on quantum brain functions, translations of ancient religious texts, and modern theoretical physics papers on consciousness. All were annotated in Dennis's precise handwriting, creating webs of connections between seemingly unrelated fields. Hindu texts describe techniques for severing consciousness from the cycle of rebirth, Dennis explained. Tibetan Buddhism includes practices for disrupting consciousness during the death transition. Ancient Egyptian priests developed rituals specifically to avoid an entity they called the consumer of souls. He flipped through the pages, pointing out highlighted sections. Quantum theory suggests consciousness involves quantum coherence in neural microtubules. If this coherence can be catastrophically disrupted at the moment of death. He trailed off, letting me fill in the implications. You think you can escape the void by destroying your brain? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. It's a hypothesis. Dennis shrugged with disturbing casualness. One I'm prepared to test. He produced another folder, this one containing what appeared to be private correspondence, emails printed on paper, handwritten letters, and transcripts of phone conversations. I'm not alone in this conclusion, he said, spreading out the documents. I've maintained limited contact with 3 other Project Threshold survivors. All have experienced the same phenomena. All have reached the same decision. I scanned the correspondence, my stomach tightening. The exchanges were coded, using scientific terminology and references to obscure research papers to mask their true content. But the meaning was clear. 4 former researchers had coordinated a plan for simultaneous suicide. You're planning a group suicide? I couldn't keep the horror from my voice. A coordinated experiment, Dennis corrected, as if the semantic difference mattered. Dr. Erickson in Portland, Dr. Whitmore in Austin, and Dr. Navarro in Baltimore. We've each selected the same method, the same time, next Tuesday at 3:17 a.m. Why that specific time? It's when the entity's perception seems strongest in our dimension, when the barrier between states is thinnest. Dennis's expression remained disturbingly serene. If our hypothesis is correct, the simultaneous destruction of 4 consciousness patterns might create sufficient disruption to prevent capture. I pushed away from the table, needing physical distance from the meticulous suicide plans. This is insanity, Dennis. Is it? He looked up at me, his eyes calm but intensely focused. After what you felt last night, after everything I've shown you? Before I could respond, Dennis reached for his phone and placed it on the table between us. There's something else you need to hear. He pressed a button, activating the speakerphone. The voicemail played with perfect clarity in the cabin's silence. Dennis, it's Elaine. A woman's voice, speaking rapidly in accented English. It's found me. Weber was right. Destroy everything. The message ended with a click that seemed to echo in the still air. Dennis watched me carefully, gauging my reaction. Dr. Elaine Chen, he explained. Project Threshold's original director. She disappeared to Taiwan in 2002, changed her identity, abandoned all technology. Dennis's finger traced circles on the table. If it found her, after all these precautions. When did you receive this? I asked. 3 days ago, the morning I called you. Dennis retrieved an envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it carefully on the table. It was sealed with wax, unmarked except for a series of numbers and symbols pressed into the seal. These are for you, he said, pushing the envelope toward me. Instructions, coordinates, access codes. I didn't touch it. For what? Evidence, documentation, everything I couldn't tell you verbally. Dennis's eyes held mine. There are 2 possibilities now, Mark. Either I'm right about consciousness destruction, in which case I'll escape the void, or I'm wrong, and it will take me like all the others. He tapped the envelope. If I'm wrong, you'll need this information, but only open it under specific conditions. Dennis leaned forward. If you ever experience what I've described, electronic malfunctions, the sensation of being watched, dreams of darkness, destroy this envelope immediately, unopened. Burn it, completely. And if I don't experience those things, then document everything. Continue the research. Find a way to protect humanity from what waits beyond death. Dennis's expression softened slightly. Though after last night, I suspect you'll be destroying this envelope sooner rather than later. I stared at the innocent-looking envelope, uncomfortable with the responsibility it represented. Dennis, you need help. Professional help, not this. There is no help for what I know. His voice remained steady, almost peaceful. You need to leave now, today. It isn't safe for you here any longer. I'm not leaving you like this, I insisted. Not when you're planning to. You have to. Dennis stood abruptly. Its awareness of you is still tenuous, still formative. There's time for you to distance yourself from this place, from me. He began gathering my belongings, packing my duffel bag with efficient movements. The longer you stay, the stronger the connection becomes. I watched him move around the cabin, stunned by his sudden urgency after days of wanting me to understand everything. What changed? I asked. Yesterday you wanted me to know everything. Now you're rushing me out? Dennis paused, considering his words carefully. Yesterday I needed you to understand. Now I need you to survive. He resumed packing my things. There's a balance between knowledge and safety. I've pushed you to the edge of that precipice, but I won't push you over. Within 20 minutes, Dennis had packed my bag and was ushering me toward the door. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine snow. My rental car sat where I'd left it, now partially buried by fresh snowfall. I've cleared the driveway enough for you to get through, Dennis said, handing me my keys. Drive carefully. The main road should be plowed by now. I stood on the porch, reluctant to leave despite the growing dread I felt in the cabin. Dennis, this doesn't have to be the end. There are people who can help. No, Mark, there aren't. For the first time since morning, emotion cracked through Dennis's calm facade. You still don't fully grasp what we're facing. He looked past me to the tree line, his eyes scanning the shadows between the pines. Something in his expression shifted, and for a brief moment I saw not the paranoid man I'd come to know, but the brilliant scientist he had once been. The greatest mercy, Dennis said quietly, is that most people die without remembering what waits. He placed his hand on my shoulder. Hold on to your skepticism as long as you can. Question everything, even what you experienced last night. I wanted to argue, to persuade him to reconsider, but the resolute certainty in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't a decision made in desperation or madness. It was the calculated choice of a man who believed he had found the only escape from something worse than death. At least promise you'll wait, I said. Give me time to research alternatives, to verify your theories. There is no more time. Dennis pressed the envelope into my hand. Now go. Don't call. Don't write. If I'm right about consciousness destruction, you'll never hear from me again, and that will be a mercy. He practically pushed me toward my car, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. I trudged through the snow, turned back once to see him standing rigidly on the porch, and then slid into the driver's seat. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy in my pocket. As I started the engine and began backing away, Dennis appeared momentarily lucid, more present than he had been during my entire visit. He raised his hand in a final farewell, his expression one of profound peace. I drove away with my rearview mirror filled with the image of Dennis growing smaller, a solitary figure against the snow-covered landscape, until a bend in the road removed him from sight entirely. 3 days later, in my hotel room in Missoula, my phone rang at 6:42 a.m. A local detective informed me that Dennis Carson had been found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. My contact information had been prominently displayed on his kitchen table. There's something else, the detective added, his voice tight with professional restraint. The cabin's interior was unusual. The walls were covered with symbols, hundreds of them, painted in the victim's blood. I closed my eyes, seeing again Dennis's calm, resolute face as I had driven away. When did it happen? Based on preliminary examination, approximately 3:17 a.m. yesterday morning. The precise time Dennis had mentioned. The coordinated moment. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the sealed envelope I had placed on the nightstand 3 days earlier. In the quiet of the room, I could almost hear Dennis's voice. If you ever experience what I've described, electronic malfunctions, the sensation of being watched, dreams of darkness, destroy this envelope immediately. I thought about the night in the cabin, when the power had failed and I'd felt something watching me from the darkness. I remembered the unnatural movements of shadows, the inexplicable calm that had settled over Dennis in his final days. With trembling fingers, I reached for the envelope, still unsure whether to open it or burn it as Dennis had instructed. Outside my window, the morning sun illuminated Missoula with deceptive normalcy, while somewhere in the shadows between thoughts, I couldn't shake the sensation that something ancient and patient was watching, waiting for my decision. February arrived with relentless rain in California, matching my state of mind as I returned to Stanford. My office felt smaller somehow, the familiar surroundings rendered strange by what I now knew, or thought I knew. I stared at my computer screen, a half-finished grant proposal for quantum field research glowing accusingly. "Mark, are you with us?" I blinked, suddenly aware of 5 colleagues staring at me across the conference table. Dr. Eliza Chen, head of our department, looked concerned. "Sorry," I mumbled. "You were saying about the funding allocation?" "We've been discussing it for 10 minutes, she said. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just distracted. Haven't been sleeping well." That much was true. Sleep had become a treacherous territory populated by dreams of floating in endless blackness, while something vast and patient watched from just beyond perception. After the meeting, I locked my office door and pulled out the notebook where I'd been documenting everything related to Project Threshold. Dennis's suicide fit the pattern he'd described. February 17th, 3:17 a.m. Eastern Time, synchronized with others who had worked on the project, all choosing methods that would completely destroy their brain structure. My academic mind rebelled against Dennis's conclusions. There had to be rational explanations, mass psychosis perhaps, or some form of shared delusion among traumatized researchers. Yet the methodical scientist in me knew only one approach: investigate the evidence systematically. I started with academic databases, searching for papers authored by names Dennis had mentioned. Most had publishing histories that simply stopped around 1994. Brilliant careers interrupted without explanation. No retractions, no follow-up work, just silence. Using university networks, I identified Dr. Samuel Rhodes, a neurologist currently at Johns Hopkins, who had been listed as a consultant on an obscure government paper co-authored by several Project Threshold members. His specialty was brain activity during traumatic events. I crafted a carefully worded email requesting an interview about his early work on consciousness during near-death experiences. His response came surprisingly quickly. "Dr. Hadley, I don't discuss that period of my research. Please pursue other avenues for your inquiry." I replied with a single sentence. "Dennis Carson suggested I contact you." 3 days of silence followed, then a phone call from a blocked number. "This is Rhodes," said a clipped voice. "What exactly did Carson tell you?" "Everything," I said, hoping the ambiguity would prompt more information than a specific question. Rhodes exhaled slowly. "Where are you located?" "Stanford." "I'll be in San Francisco next Tuesday. The Fairmont Hotel Bar, 8 p.m. Come alone and don't bring recording devices." He hung up before I could respond. The Fairmont's ornate bar was busy with business travelers when I arrived. Rhodes sat in a corner booth, a tumbler of amber liquid before him. He was younger than I expected, mid-50s, with prematurely white hair and the tanned face of someone who spent time outdoors. "Dr. Hadley." He didn't stand or offer his hand. "What exactly did Carson share with you?" I slid into the booth. "Project Threshold. The Void. Weber's encounter with something in that void. The entity that's hunting the researchers." Rhodes's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. "Carson always did drink too much. Made him paranoid. He showed me documentation, government files, medical records. Your name was on some of the consulting paperwork." The waiter approached. Rhodes ordered another scotch. I asked for the same. "I consulted on brain response to trauma," Rhodes said after the waiter left. "My involvement was peripheral. 3 months. I never participated in the actual procedures." "But you knew what they were doing?" He swirled his remaining scotch, ice clinking against the glass. "They presented it as research into extending the brain's viability after clinical death, pushing the revival window, revolutionary medical possibilities." "When did you learn the truth?" Rhodes smiled thinly. "What makes you think Carson's version is the truth? 12 suicides among former project personnel, all using methods specifically destroying the brain." I leaned forward. "I found the death certificates, Dr. Rhodes." Something flickered in his eyes, resignation perhaps, or fear. Our drinks arrived. Rhodes downed half of his immediately. "What exactly do you want from me?" "Confirmation. Was Dennis right about what they found? About what happens after death?" Rhodes stared into his glass for a long moment. "What happens when you put researchers in high-stress situations with questionable ethical parameters? They break. They experience trauma. They develop shared delusions to rationalize their guilt. That's not an answer. It's the only sane one." Rhodes lowered his voice. "Look, people experience something during clinical death, something disturbing, but interpreting those experiences as evidence of some malevolent cosmic entity? That's the traumatized mind searching for patterns. You don't believe what they found was real." Rhodes leaned back, suddenly looking very tired. "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that brilliant people destroyed themselves over these interpretations. Don't follow them down that path." "Why did you come meet me if you think it's all delusion?" "Because Carson wasn't the only one watching for patterns." Rhodes finished his drink. 12 suicides, you said. That number's wrong. It's 17 now." He placed a thumb drive on the table and slid it toward me. "Official personnel list, death records, my notes from the consultation period, everything I have." I picked it up. "Why give me this if you think it's all trauma-induced misinterpretation?" "Because you'll look anyway. Better you have actual data than Carson's paranoid version." Rhodes stood, placing cash on the table. "One piece of advice, Dr. Hadley. Don't go looking for Weber's daughter. She's buried 3 project researchers who came asking questions." He walked away, then paused. "And whatever you do, don't spend too much time thinking about the void. Obsession creates its own reality." The thumb drive contained exactly what he'd promised: personnel files, death records, and his consultation notes. Rhodes had been documenting psychological deterioration among the research team: paranoia, sleep disturbances, and consistent reports of feeling watched. His final entry noted simply, "resigning from consultation." Ethical concerns noted and dismissed by project director. Subject welfare compromised by researcher instability. I ignored Rhodes's warning about Weber's daughter. Harold Weber's obituary listed a surviving daughter, Olivia Weber, last known address in Baltimore. University connections helped me locate her current information. Now Olivia Brennan, associate professor of mathematics at Johns Hopkins. My request for a meeting received a terse reply. "My father's work remains private. I do not discuss it with researchers. I booked a flight to Baltimore anyway." Olivia Weber. Brennan lived in a Victorian townhouse in a leafy Baltimore neighborhood. She opened the door before I could knock, her tall figure silhouetted against the hallway light. "You shouldn't have come," she said by way of greeting. Her face was angular like her father's in the photographs, with the same piercing eyes. "5 minutes," I said. "Then I'll leave if you want." She studied me, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. Her home office contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with advanced mathematics texts. On one wall hung framed equations I recognized from Dennis's photographs, Weber's work from his final days. "You've met others from the project," I said, noting her lack of surprise at my arrival. 4, she replied, seating herself behind a desk. 2 killed themselves within months of visiting. 1 disappeared. The last one sends Christmas cards from a monastery in Tibet where he's taken a vow of silence. I met with Dennis Carson. He's dead now too. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, but confirmation. February 17th? I nodded. They all choose significant dates, she said quietly. Anniversaries of the experiments. Dad's death. Times when they believe the barrier is thinnest. You don't seem surprised by any of this. Olivia sighed, running a hand through her dark hair streaked with premature gray. My father was dying of pancreatic cancer when he volunteered for their experiments. He was a physicist, not some desperate patient seeking miracle cures. He knew exactly what he was doing. Which was what? Testing a theory he'd developed decades earlier. She stood and moved to a locked cabinet. After his death, the government returned his personal effects. 3 journals with pages torn out. Mathematical formulations with key components missing. She unlocked the cabinet and removed a leather-bound journal, placing it on the desk between us. This is what they didn't find. His actual work. I opened the journal carefully. The pages contained the same equations I'd seen in Dennis's photographs, but complete, annotated with Weber's precise handwriting. He theorized that consciousness functioned as a quantum field that could persist independently of biological structures, Olivia explained. He called it the persistence theory, the idea that awareness itself might be the fundamental property of existence rather than an emergent phenomenon. I turned pages filled with complex mathematical expressions. These formulas describe consciousness as a form of quantum information. Precisely. Dad believed consciousness might transition to another state after biological death, not supernatural, but following physical laws we don't yet understand. Olivia tapped the journal. What he didn't anticipate was what existed in that state already. The entity. She nodded once. He called me the night before he died. The phone woke me at 3:17 a.m. He was completely calm, explaining that he'd encountered something during clinical death. Something ancient and vast that had become aware of him. Of us. You believed him? I'm a mathematician, Dr. Hadley. I believe in evidence and logical proof. She retrieved another journal from the cabinet. After his suicide, I received this through an anonymous courier. This journal contained observations written in Weber's hand, dated after his participation in Project Threshold. The entries documented phenomena Dennis had described: moving shadows, electronic disruptions, the persistent feeling of being watched. The last entry, Olivia said, her voice tight. I turned to it. The final page contained a single line. It knows too much now. I must eliminate the neural architecture it's using to track me. My father was the most rational person I've ever known, Olivia said, taking the journals back. He taught me to question everything, to demand empirical evidence. And in his final days, he was absolutely certain that death wasn't the end, just a transition to something worse. Do you believe it? She closed the cabinet carefully. I believe something happened to those researchers. Something that made mathematicians and physicists and doctors decide that obliterating their own brains was preferable to what waited for them after natural death. My 5 minutes had stretched to 30. As Olivia showed me out, she handed me a USB drive. Digital copies of his complete journals, she said. I've never shared these with anyone else. Don't make me regret it. At the door, she gripped my arm suddenly. One more thing. Dad's earlier work. The theoretical foundation for his consciousness research. Princeton has it in their physics archive. Special collections. It predates Project Threshold by decades. 2 days later, I sat in Princeton's archive room reviewing papers Harold Weber had published between 1958 and 1972. His early work explored theoretical boundaries between existence and non-existence, proposing mathematical models for states that were neither fully existent nor completely absent. One paper from 1963 particularly stood out: negative existence, theoretical framework for anti-structure in quantum systems. Weber had proposed that just as antimatter existed as the opposite of matter, there might be a form of anti-existence that functioned as the opposite of existence itself, not simply nothingness, but an active negation of being. The paper had been largely dismissed by his contemporaries as interesting but unprovable mathematical speculation. But reading it in light of what I now knew about Project Threshold, Weber's work seemed less like theoretical abstraction and more like prescient discovery. As I was preparing to leave, an archive assistant brought me one final folder. Found this in cross-referenced materials. Might be relevant to your research on Dr. Weber. The folder contained correspondence between Weber and a Dr. Anna Morris, dated 1991 to 1994. The letters discussed convergent observations regarding threshold states of consciousness, with references to Morris's work with terminal patients. I traced Dr. Morris to a hospice center in Philadelphia where she still worked at age 74. When I called, she agreed to meet immediately, her voice carrying an urgency that surprised me. "I've been waiting for someone from the project to contact me," she said when I arrived at the hospice center. Harold said someone would come eventually. Dr. Morris was a small woman with alert eyes and steady hands. She led me to a quiet office filled with filing cabinets. "I'm not from the project," I clarified. "I'm investigating it." "Close enough." She unlocked a cabinet and removed several thick binders. "I've been a hospice nurse for 47 years, Dr. Hadley. I've been present for over 3,000 deaths." She opened a binder filled with handwritten notes. Around 1985, I began noticing patterns in final utterances. Terminal patients, moments before death, reporting similar experiences, not the peaceful light or deceased relatives that near-death survivors describe, but something else. The pages contained thousands of documented statements from dying patients, categorized and cross-referenced. I published my observations in medical journals as curiosities, Dr. Morris continued. Harold Weber contacted me after reading one such article. We began corresponding about the differences between near-death experiences and actual final moments before irreversible death. She pointed to specific entries, patients with no connection to each other, from different cultural and religious backgrounds, describing similar experiences in their final moments. "It's empty, but aware. Something's waiting in the darkness. I can feel it watching me. There's nothing there, but it sees me." Weber believed my patients were glimpsing the void before clinical death, Morris said. That consciousness began transitioning before the body fully died, allowing momentary awareness of what waited beyond. "You've continued documenting these statements since Weber's death?" She nodded. "Over 1,500 additional cases. The patterns remain consistent." Morris met my gaze directly. "I'm a scientist, Dr. Hadley. I don't believe in supernatural explanations, but I've witnessed too many deaths to ignore the consistency in these reports." I spent hours reviewing her documentation. As night fell, Morris drove me to my hotel, our conversation continuing in her car. "Weber visited me after his experience in the project," she said as we pulled up to the hotel. "He was a changed man, unnaturally calm. He told me what he'd encountered and said that my patients had been right all along. Consciousness persisted after death, but not as religion promised." "Did you believe him?" Morris's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I believed something had profoundly affected him. Whether it was what he claimed or some psychological trauma from the experiments, I couldn't say." She hesitated. "Until the phenomena began." "What phenomena?" "Electronics malfunctioning in my presence, the persistent feeling of being watched, dreams of infinite darkness." Morris's voice remained clinical, detached. The same phenomena Weber described experiencing after his encounter. "You think something followed him back? Became aware of you through him?" "I think consciousness is more complex than our current science can explain." She pulled a business card from her pocket. "My direct line. Call me when it starts happening to you too." Back in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I spread my notes across the bed, connecting threads between Weber's theories, Dennis's experiences, and Morris's patient documentation. The rational part of my mind still sought alternative explanations. Mass psychosis, suggestibility, the power of toxic ideas to infect vulnerable minds. Yet the evidence was becoming harder to dismiss. 17 suicides among project personnel, all destroying their brains. Weber's mathematical models predicting exactly what the subjects reported experiencing. Morris's documentation spanning decades. My laptop battery died suddenly despite being fully charged. When I plugged it in, the screen remained black for several seconds before flickering to life with all my open documents closed, except for a blank text document I didn't remember creating. As I watched, text appeared character by character, though my hands weren't touching the keyboard. "I see you, Mark." I slammed the laptop closed and yanked the power cord from the wall. My heart pounded against my ribs as sweat broke out across my forehead. For several minutes, I stood perfectly still in the darkened hotel room, aware of the shadows in the corners in a way I never had been before. The sensation of being observed intensified until I could barely breathe. With shaking hands, I reached for my bag and removed the sealed envelope Dennis had given me. Inside, I found a handwritten note with coordinates in Nevada, a small silver key attached to a numbered tag, and 4 words that made my blood run cold. "It knows your name now." The low hum of the hotel air conditioning suddenly seemed to contain patterns, almost like whispered words just below the threshold of comprehension. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked back with eyes that seemed darker than they should have been. I knew then that everything Dennis had told me was true. The void was real. The entity was real. And now it was watching me. I spent the remainder of that night in my hotel bathroom, every light blazing, back pressed against the wall. The sealed envelope Dennis had given me lay open on the counter, its contents scattered beside the sink. Coordinates in Nevada, a small silver key with a numbered tag, and that damning note, "It knows your name now." My laptop remained unplugged, its screen dark. I couldn't bring myself to touch it after seeing those words form character by character. Even now, hours later, I could feel something watching me from the shadows between the light fixtures. Not imagination, not paranoia. Something real and ancient and patient. By morning, I had made my decision. If the entity had found me, as it had found Dennis and Weber and all the others, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing. I checked out of the hotel without returning to my room, purchasing new clothes from the gift shop rather than retrieving my suitcase. At the airport, I bought a ticket to Las Vegas using cash, my hands still trembling slightly as I counted out bills. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under harsh sunlight as I drove my rental car north from Vegas. The coordinates led me to a small town called Ely, where rows of identical storage facilities baked in the afternoon heat. Unit number 4217 was at the back of the complex, a standard 10x10 space with a roll-up metal door. The silver key slid perfectly into the padlock. Inside, a single metal filing cabinet stood centered in the otherwise empty space. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for what appeared to be decades. The cabinet drawers opened with groaning protests. Inside the top drawer sat a lead-lined box, sealed with industrial-grade tape that had yellowed with age. A note taped to its surface read, "Quantum shielding may prevent detection. Theory unconfirmed. XZ, Dr. Shulin Zhao," the project director Dennis had mentioned. I carried the box to my car, constantly scanning my surroundings for, what? Government agents? Shadowy figures? I wasn't even sure what I was looking for anymore. The weight of the box felt disproportionate to its size, as if it contained more than just paper and recordings. In my motel room, I placed the box on the bed and carefully cut through the aged tape. The lid lifted with surprising ease, revealing meticulously organized folders, microcassettes, and several small notebooks bound with rubber bands. The top document was a letter addressed simply, to whoever finds this. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a woman's hand. If you are reading this, you have likely encountered the phenomena and survived long enough to seek answers. I am Dr. Xiulan Zhao, former director of Project Threshold. By the time you read this, I will have either escaped its attention or, more likely, joined my colleagues in the only escape we have found. Everything you need to understand what you are facing is contained in these documents. Most importantly, my private research journal details my theories regarding countermeasures. The entity can be opposed, perhaps even defeated. Whoever you are, you now bear this knowledge. What you do with it will determine not just your fate, but potentially the fate of all consciousness. With grave responsibility, Dr. Xiulan Zhao. My hands trembled as I set the letter aside. Beneath it lay personnel files with photographs, complete, unredacted versions of the documents Dennis had shown me. Each file contained a subject's medical history, experimental parameters, and detailed notes on their experiences during clinical death. Subject number 17's file included full transcripts of his interviews before his suicide attempt, far more detailed than what Dennis had shown me. It recognizes individuality. It isolates consciousness by detecting unique patterns, like quantum fingerprints. And it feeds on awareness itself, not destroying it, consuming it while allowing it to remain conscious of being consumed. The clinical language couldn't mask the horror in the subject's descriptions. Page after page documented similar accounts, the void, the sense of eternal isolation, and in some cases, encounters with what Weber had later experienced, the entity that watched from within that emptiness. I moved on to Dr. Zhao's personal journal, a black notebook filled with elegant handwriting. Her scientific detachment remained evident despite the disturbing content. April 17th, 1995. After reviewing Weber's equations and comparing them to previous subject accounts, I no longer believe we encountered a supernatural phenomenon. The entity appears to be an ancient, non-corporeal consciousness residing in a parallel dimensional state that our experiments inadvertently accessed. June 3, 1995. Evidence suggests consciousness doesn't terminate at death, but transitions to this parallel state where the entity resides. The void subjects described isn't emptiness, but a domain where consciousness exists without physical sensory input. The entity appears to feed on consciousness itself, not destroying it, but maintaining it in a state of awareness while somehow drawing energy from it. September 12, 1995. The phenomena are increasing. Electronics malfunction more frequently. The feeling of being watched is now constant. Sleep has become impossible without heavy sedation, and even then, dreams of infinite darkness persist. December 25, 1995. Breakthrough today. If Weber's equations are correct, consciousness transitions through quantum entanglement patterns established during life. These patterns act as anchors, allowing the entity to locate and capture specific consciousness after death. Disrupting these patterns at the moment of death might sever the connection, potentially allowing consciousness to disperse rather than transition intact to the entity's domain. The journal continued with increasingly detailed theoretical work on consciousness anchoring patterns and potential technologies to disrupt them. Dr. Zhao's initially precise handwriting deteriorated over time, becoming jagged and rushed in later entries. February 17, 1997. Others have found me. Parker, Wilson, Khatri, all experiencing escalating phenomena. We are collaborating on countermeasure prototypes. Time is limited. It knows we're working against it. The final entry, dated March 3, 2001, consisted of a single line. It's too close now. I've secured the research. Someone will find it when the time is right. Next, I found a set of microcassettes labeled Countermeasure Discussions, with dates ranging from 1996 to 1999. I located a small tape player at the bottom of the box and inserted the first cassette. Dr. Zhao's voice emerged, calm but strained. Session 1, Countermeasure Development Team. Present. Dr. Zhao, Dr. Parker, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Khatri. A male voice followed. The principle is sound. Quantum disruption at the moment of neural cessation. The challenge is creating a field strong enough to break entanglement patterns without affecting nearby consciousness. The prototype requires further miniaturization, another voice added. Current dimensions make practical application impossible outside laboratory settings. The recordings continued with detailed technical discussions about quantum field generators, consciousness pattern mapping, and theoretical models for severing what they called transition anchors. Despite the scientific language, the desperation in their voices became increasingly evident in later recordings. The final tape contained only Dr. Zhao. Final recording. The others are gone now, self-terminated. I've continued the work alone, but it's found me too. The prototype is incomplete but functional in laboratory conditions. I've included the schematics and test data. This technology must survive. Humanity deserves protection from what waits beyond death. I spent 3 days in that motel room, reviewing every document, listening to every recording, piecing together the complete picture of Project Threshold and its aftermath. The scientific evidence was overwhelming, methodically documented by brilliant minds pushed to their breaking point by what they'd discovered. As night fell on the 3rd day, I noticed the shadows in the corner of the room moving slightly against the light from the bedside lamp. Not imagination. A distinct, deliberate movement independent of any physical cause. On my phone screen, text appeared briefly before the device shut down completely. I am still watching. I packed everything back into the lead-lined box, my decision already forming. This knowledge couldn't die with me, as it had with Dennis and the others, but releasing it to the world would cause unimaginable panic. Death, the one certainty all humans faced, would become a terror beyond comprehension. The flight back to California gave me time to refine my plan. In my campus office, I placed the lead box in a locked cabinet and began researching private research foundations. If Dr. Zhao believed countermeasures were possible, I would continue her work, but cautiously, strategically, without drawing attention to the true purpose. Over the following weeks, I established the framework for what would become the Quantum Consciousness Research Foundation. On paper, we would study the theoretical underpinnings of consciousness from a quantum perspective. Privately, we would develop Dr. Zhao's countermeasure technology. I encrypted Dennis's evidence and my notes from Nevada, dividing them into fragments distributed to 5 trusted colleagues around the world, theoretical physicists whose minds were open enough to consider unconventional ideas. Each received instructions for assembly should anything happen to me, ensuring the knowledge wouldn't die with any single person. The phenomena continued. Shadows moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Electronics malfunctioned in consistent patterns. The feeling of being observed remained constant, especially during quiet moments when my thoughts turned to the void. My dreams filled with endless darkness where something vast and ancient watched with patient hunger. Sometimes I woke gasping, convinced I'd felt cold tendrils of awareness brushing against my mind. Yet I maintained my scientific discipline. I documented every occurrence, correlating them with my research activities. Patterns emerged. The phenomena intensified when I worked directly with Weber's equations or Zhao's countermeasure designs. They diminished when I focused on unrelated subjects. 6 months after finding the storage unit, I secured initial funding for the foundation. My proposal carefully framed the research in acceptable theoretical terms, while concealing its true purpose. I recruited promising graduate students and researchers with specialties in quantum physics, consciousness studies, and advanced engineering, people who could contribute to the countermeasure technology without understanding its ultimate application. In my private office, I kept a small digital recorder running constantly, documenting my experiences and insights. Like Dennis before me, I found myself checking shadows, avoiding sleep, startling at electronic glitches. Unlike Dennis, I refused to surrender to fear. 1 year after Dennis's suicide, I stood in my foundation's new laboratory, watching as my team assembled the first prototype quantum field generator based on Dr. Zhao's designs. The device was far from the portable technology we would eventually need, but it represented the first concrete step toward a countermeasure. That night, alone in my apartment, the shadows gathered in unusual density in the corners. My television turned itself on, cycling through channels before settling on static. In that white noise, I could almost discern patterns, something trying to communicate. I faced the darkness directly. "I know you're watching," I said aloud, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. "But I'm watching back now." The static abruptly ceased. The shadows retreated to normal configurations, but the feeling of being observed intensified, not with rage, but with something that felt almost like interest. I understood then that this wasn't the end of my story, merely the beginning of a longer struggle. There might be no escaping death itself, that fundamental transition all living things must face, but perhaps humanity could be protected from what waited beyond.